I'm still Malcolm Daniel. I'm still the Gus and Linda Wortham Curator of Photography here at the museum, and very happy to welcome you to the museum this evening and to the exhibition Sally Mann, A Thousand Crossings. The exhibition, as you can see on the screen, is organized by the National Gallery of Art in Washington and the Peabody Essex Museum in Salem, Massachusetts. It was shown at those two institutions, and then most recently at the Getty Museum in Los Angeles before coming to us. And when it closes here in June, it will move to Paris to the Jeu de Paume and come back to the US for a final presentation at the High Museum in Atlanta. I hope some of you have probably gone upstairs. The exhibition is in this building on the upper level of this building, and so I hope to see you upstairs in the show right afterwards. I also want to recommend to you the catalog, which is just beautifully designed and luxuriously printed, published by the National Gallery and with wonderful essays in it. And I wrote one essay, I'm proud to be a part of it, but all of the essays are great. So I want to recommend that to you. And also Sally Mann's memoir, and some of you may have been here 2 years ago when she came and did a reading from it. And you know, it really annoys me that any one person should be so masterfully talented in two completely different disciplines, but she is as beautiful a writer as she is a photographer, and I'll be quoting Sally a bit this evening, but I heartily recommend the memoir called Hold Still. Sally was born in Lexington, Virginia. She still lives there, and this exhibition, while it spans about 3 decades of her work from the mid-1980s to the present day, is not a full retrospective. It's not everything she's done. It's divided into 5 sections that are unified by her love of the place she lives, her identification as a Southerner and as a Southern artist, and that's the thread that we'll follow this evening. The five sections, we'll take them one by one, but they deal with family, with the land, with the legacy of the Civil War, the legacy of slavery and race relations in the U.S., and the frailty of life. There's some artists who think they have the answers to the big questions of life, the problems of our society and of our particular time, and they try to share those answers with us through their art. And instead, I've come to understand Mann's work in a different way, that the photographs that we see on the walls upstairs are not her answers, but part of her process, part of the searching for answers to questions that are both personal and universal. How to understand the complexities of childhood. How are we shaped by the land and the history and the culture of the place in which we live? What does it mean to be a Southern artist? Is it possible to heal the wounds of America's racial history? What is it like to ponder one's own mortality? So I think of Mann's photographs as part of her process of self-exploration, and we're simply privileged to witness her search and maybe be prompted ourselves to ask those questions ourselves. They pose the questions more than they provide the answers. When you go upstairs into the gallery, the first section that we get to is about family. She wrote, "The place is important, the time is summer. It's any summer, but the place is home, and the people here are my family." She was a young mother of 3 by the mid-1980s, camera always in hand, and the subject at hand was her family, her children. And we begin the show with 2 photographs, Blowing Bubbles and Jessie Bites. On the left, Blowing Bubbles, Jessie blowing bubbles Virginia, the younger daughter, looking somewhat warily at the camera, baby doll up on the railing. And in a sense, those bubbles are a great metaphor for childhood. Beautiful, but fleeting, fragile and fleeting. On the right, Jessie bites, a picture that's about the competing desires for attachment and independence. Sally wrote, out of a conviction that my lens should remain open to the full scope of their childhood, and with the willing creative participation of everyone involved, I photographed their triumphs, confusion, harmony, and isolation, as well as the hardships that tend to befall children: bruises, vomit, bloody noses, wet beds, all of it. When I stepped behind the camera and my kids stepped in front of it, I was a photographer and they were actors, and we were making photographs together. In fact, in Jessie Bites, the teeth marks on Sally's arm are not Jessie's, they're Sally's own. She bit her own arm, and Jessie, outfitted with some war paint, reenacted a sullen expression there to make the picture tell the story that they both wanted to. So it's not just a sentimental view of childhood that many photographers have portrayed, but one that's a fuller portrayal of the complexities. It's also a blend of fact and fiction. And for that, I think maybe it's best to look at a picture called Easter Dress. Now, some of you will know the work of Henri Cartier-Bresson, whose most famous book, the English title of his famous book is The Decisive Moment. And Cartier-Bresson very famously said, to me, photography is the simultaneous recognition in a fraction of a second of the significance of an event, as well as of the precise organization of forms which give that event its proper expression. The creative act lasts but a brief moment, a lightning instant of give and take, just long enough for you to level the camera and trap the fleeting prey in your little box. We look at Sally's picture, we might think that's exactly what happened. It looks so much like a candid snapshot that she was lucky enough to get at just the moment when Jessie stands there in her Easter dress, glowing. In fact, that's not at all the case. Almost everything in the show, with the exception of the color pictures that I'll show you in a moment, but everything else was made with a large format camera, usually an 8x10. So a camera that's bulky, that's on a tripod, and that requires longer exposures. It needs everybody to stand still, for instance. So Sally had the idea for this, for the picture, Easter Dress. The dress itself was made by Mann's grandmother, Jessie Adams Evans, and she saved it, Sally Mann saved it for her own daughter, Jessie, the namesake of Jessie Adams Evans. And I want to mention that the exhibition has, there are 2 films in the show, which I encourage you to watch. And there's also an audio guide that was produced by the Getty Museum. And it's quite wonderful because you hear Sally's voice describing many of the pictures. And so I can't imitate her voice, but I'm going to quote a little bit from her description of making this picture. She said, I placed Jessie in the center of the picture and told her not to move an iota. I wanted her to be serene and luminous while all kinds of stuff was going on around her. I placed Emmett over to the right, holding onto the fence, which would keep him in the correct plane of focus, and I put baby Virginia in between and promised her a popsicle if she'd stand still. Then I borrowed an Irish wolfhound from the owner of the hill, and I borrowed her grandfather too, and asked him if he could try to get the damn dog to sit still. I've wrangled more dogs than any SPCA, trying to get them to stay in the right place in a picture. But in this case, the dog's movement and the man's gesture trying to keep it still proved to be just the right element for the picture, adding to the sense of chaos around the gleaming child. So I think that's a wonderful example of this, the sense of it not being just a moment captured, but of a construction of a picture, of a blending of fact and fiction, and of the collaboration that was a part of so many pictures. The children also learned the kind of picture that their mom liked, and sometimes suggested subjects, such as this one, and they would work together to create the picture. There are three small pictures that Sally Mann thinks of as a kind of memorial to her son, Emmett, these three. The family lives on a large farm outside of Lexington in a bend in the Maury River, and there's a rustic cabin down by the river's edge where they tend to spend the summer days. No electricity, no running water, but it's a kind of private Eden for them. And the kids, like Sally herself, have spent many days there along the cliffs and among the woods and in the river. You may remember that many of these pictures were published in a book in 1992 called Immediate Family, which, much to Sally's surprise and dismay, was caught up in the culture wars of the moment. You remember the controversy about NEA support of the arts and the photographs of Robert Mapplethorpe and Jock Sturgis and such. And it just unleashed all sorts of abusive attacks by various critics and moral guardians who questioned not only the propriety of the images, but also Mann's worthiness as a mother, without understanding the collaborative nature and the sort of acting that the kids were doing. She herself had grown up, she describes it, in a kind of feral way, being put out with the dogs in the morning, and she never put on clothes until she went to kindergarten. And so the nudity, which many people found objectionable or exploitive in some way, was just something that was no big deal within the privacy of the family. But it did spark a lot of controversy. Rick Woodward wrote a long piece for the New York Times Magazine, The Disturbing Photographs of Sally Mann. The Wall Street Journal published this picture of a picture of Virginia that made it look like, as if the original was pornographic, and you have Virginia's response at the right. I don't like what does it say? I don't like the way you crossed me out. I will be 6 on Friday. In fact, if we look at the history of photography, there are many instances of nudity, both adult and child. Gertrude Casebeer on the left, Julia Margaret Cameron in the middle, Edward Weston on the right. I think it had to do with the particular moment that we were in, and the family pictures now are looked back at with great admiration and a sense of them being incredibly perceptive and evocative images of childhood. In 1991, someone gave Mann a Mamiya camera that was a handheld camera that took roll film that made 2 1/4-inch square negatives, and she decided to use color film for that. It's the only time she's done that. But the portability of that camera, the fact that it was 1.5 pounds and not 20 pounds and didn't require a tripod and she could walk around with it, allowed her to make pictures that were somewhat more spontaneous and sort of genuinely spontaneous rather than set up spontaneous. She wrote to someone at the time. She said, as I thought about making a picture with a child in it, I came to be seduced by the landscape, first of all, and then I would find a way to place the subject in it rather than the other way around. In a certain way, I was ambushed by the landscapes. And indeed, the next section of the show is about the land. And one thing that you'll notice right away is a change in scale. And it's wonderful to see these pictures up in our Upper Brown Pavilion. They hold the wall wonderfully. They have a great impact, a kind of enveloping size to them. I think she also turned to the land. To be honest, I think she also began photographing the land, partly because she was seduced by it, loved the land that she had grown up with, and also as a way of stepping away from the controversy that came with the immediate family pictures. So she began with the familiar landscape of Virginia around her home, the fields and hills around the Mann home, such as this, and photographed in the early morning or the evening when the light had a particular quality and the atmosphere felt palpably humid. And then in the mid-90s, she started to move further south, into the deep south, to Georgia, to Mississippi, and to Louisiana. And this is a particularly beautiful tree, beautiful photograph. And she tells the story. She said, early in the trip, I met a friendly couple at a lecture in northern Mississippi. I told them what I was doing, and they asked where I was staying. In the back of the Suburban, I told them. She was traveling around with a Suburban, an SUV, the far back of which she had transformed into a kind of portable darkroom, and I'll show you that shortly. But she was, basically sleeping in the back of the Suburban. And then, as a joke, I asked them if they wouldn't happen to have a furnished antebellum house in Louisiana where I could live for a week. Oh, and haha, I wanted this too. Not just a free house, but a free house with killer pictures within a few feet of the back door. After sharing a glance, they turned to me with apologetic dismay and said that their family had such a house, but it was in Mississippi, 3 miles from the Louisiana border. Could it possibly suit anyway? So they gave her the keys. She traveled there, sort of arrived at night, and the next morning walked out the back door and saw this tree. And this is, in a way, exactly what she was searching for. It was a wound that had healed but remained visible, and it became a metaphor for the South, the idea of memory embedded in the landscape. It also reveals, in a sense, her knowledge of and her homage to 19th century photography. So, for instance, in that tree, we see the echoes of the great 19th century French landscapist, Gustave Le Gray. And here's another example. The one on the left, called Fontainebleau. The one on the right, by Le Gray from the 1850s, also called Forest of Fontainebleau. But Sally Mann's picture is not made in France. It's made in a park near New Orleans called Fontainebleau. But you can see a shared sensibility. She's interested in history, she's interested in art history, she's interested in literature, and the kinds of references that we find are not accidental. She had been interested in 19th century photography actually for almost a quarter century. In 1973, when she was barely in her 20s and she was serving as the school photographer at Washington and Lee University, which is in Lexington, she was making pictures of the athletic teams and things like that. She stumbled upon 7,500 glass negatives that were stacked up against the walls and in piles and boxes on the floor in the attic of one of the university buildings. Unsheathed, coated with dust, scratched. Sometimes they were broken, glass shards scattered on the wood floor. And those pictures were by a man named Michael Miley, who was a returning Civil War veteran who settled in Lexington. He was from Lexington. He returned to Lexington and began photographing the area there. And as Sally Mann cleaned and cataloged the Miley negatives, and she printed about 1,000 of them. She recognized bits of the local terrain. She recognized the cliffs that you saw in that one called River Dance, which is right opposite the family cabin, and other spots around Lexington. But what stuck in her mind more than that sort of pleasurable time travel and the recognition of familiar places, what stuck in her mind two decades later were those pictures, such as the one on the screen, where the photographer had accepted unforeseen accidents, the uneven coating of the emulsion, or imperfect processing, or the kind of unexpected solarization that you see in the foreground here. And also sort of what the ensuing years had done to the negatives. So the peeling emulsion or the broken glass that bore witness to their long forgotten status. She liked that. For the family pictures, she claimed she could out-Ansel the best atoms. In other words, she was an absolute master of technique. But she liked all those accidents that she saw in the 19th century pictures. And so she learned in 1997, she learned what we call the wet plate process, or the collodion process, or glass negative process, the most common process for making photographic negatives in the 19th century. And it's the process that was used, for instance, during the Civil War. And so she learned from Mark and France Osterman. Mark Osterman is now the process historian at George Eastman House in Rochester, and he was one of the few people, he and his wife, France Scully Osterman, were among the few people at that time who knew how to recreate those 19th century processes. And Mark wrote a self-published manual about how to do it, and I took a snap of Sally's copy of it when I visited her, because I loved how it was just completely stained. You get a sense of all the chemistry and the notes and everything else there, and we in fact have included it in the exhibition upstairs. And you can see the Suburban that she's converted to a traveling darkroom, and at the right, sort of cleaning one of the plates or some part of the process there. And I recommend the first of the films in the exhibition shows Mann making a photograph with a collodion negative and explaining not only how but why she chooses that medium. So as she traveled in the South, she made pictures like this at the old Valentine Windsor plantation, which was in ruins, not from the Civil War, but from a fire in 1890, but nonetheless was evocative of the once glorious and somewhat ruined Old South. And here you see how she's invited the peeling at the edges and slight imperfections throughout the picture to evoke the kind of photograph that I showed you a moment ago by Michael Miley. In the room of landscapes, there are three that I want to point out in particular. I think all of you probably know the story of Emmett Till, the 14-year-old African-American youth from Chicago who visited relatives in Money, Mississippi in 1955, and was falsely accused of having flirted with a white woman in a store, and for that was kidnapped, tortured, and murdered. This was a story that haunted Sally Mann from childhood and throughout her life. And in fact, she named her son Emmett after Emmett Till. And so when she traveled to the South, she went to Money, Mississippi, and made these photographs. On the left, the bridge at Glendora, Mississippi, where it's believed that Till's body was thrown into the river with the heavy fan of a cotton gin tied around him. And of course she could have positioned her camera any place, but she chose to do it here, where you see coming in from the left this scraggly branch, almost like the hand of death, just reaching towards the bridge there. And this somewhat probably accidental chemical drip there, almost like a teardrop. And on the right, she found the place with the help of local people, the place where it's believed that Till's body was pulled from the river. This gash in the earth, and such a nondescript place. How could something so remarkable and consequential have happened at such an unremarkable place? And a third picture connected, not literally, but connected nonetheless to Till's story. Near the place where she was photographing, she saw this, which looked like almost like a human form on the ground. And in fact, she was told by the locals, oh, this is how people are buried here. It's just the cement poured over the body. And so that also became an evocation of Till, though in contrast to the open casket that Till's mother insisted on having so that the world should see what had happened to her son. But those journeys to the South, and thinking about the history of the South, the landscape that she loved, but the history that was so fraught, prompted her next to seek out the battlefields of the Civil War, and that's the next section of the show. When I spoke of that tree being a kind of metaphor, it's the sort of question she asked: does the earth remember? Do these fields upon which unspeakable carnage occurred, where unknowable numbers of bodies are buried, bear witness in some way? So between 2000 and 2003, she traveled to Civil War battlefields, and in fact, a third of the battles of the Civil War were fought on Virginia soil. So she began close to home. They're not at all topographic renderings. It's not, I don't know if you've visited Civil War battlefields, you know, there's always the parking lot full of tour buses, and there are lots of people on the grounds and looking and trying to figure out the terrain and what it was like and which company moved in which direction. And that's not what she was interested in. She wanted to try to evoke the experience of the war. And she sought out kind of deserted corners of the battlefields, places like this one at Fredericksburg, where she actually was shooting during the daytime, but the exposures that she made and the way she printed them give the impression, for instance, of nightfall, or here something absolutely apocalyptic, you know, hurricane or tornado. Though all of those swirls around the trees, that's all sort of invited accidents of pouring the collodion on her glass plate negative here in Fredericksburg. It becomes expressive. Similarly, in the picture of Cold Harbor, all those little white streaks, those are the result of dust on her plate, and therefore when she coated the plate or sensitized the plate, it interfered with the smooth coating. But of course they look like it's just a hail of bullets there to suggest what happened at Cold Harbor. There's 6 pictures at Antietam, where some 23,000 Confederate and Union soldiers died. And so she's positioned her camera low to the ground, the horizon somewhat tilted, the sun darkening, the picture darkening, almost not like nightfall, but like the failing vision of a dying soldier. Again, sometimes she referenced 19th century pictures. So at Wilderness, she knew the work of a photographer perhaps unknown, perhaps Alexander Gardner. She knew the pictures that were made in 1864 that recorded the way that trees had just been blasted by the amount of bullets and shot between the two sides. And so she sought out a blasted tree that would reference that in a literal way, but also stand in as a metaphor for a living thing cut down before its prime. When you see the pictures upstairs, you'll also notice that they have a strange surface. They're not glazed at all. They are varnished with a kind of dirt, a diatomaceous earth, the sort of fossilized remains of little marine organisms mixed into the varnish, so that they have a gritty, matte quality to them. And it's almost as though she's put the earth that she's photographing into her pictures. The fourth section of the show is the largest and the most complex, and she calls it Abide With Me. And it's her attempt to try to understand the legacy of slavery and of racism, and of her own life and the way she was blind to it. What were any of us thinking? Why did we never ask the questions? That's the mystery of it, our blindness and our silence. And it has 4 elements in this part of the exhibition, 2 that are about spirit and 2 that are about the physical world. And the first are pictures of Virginia Franklin Carter, who Sally Mann called Gigi. This was the African-American woman who worked for the Mann family for 50 years and who raised and nurtured Sally Mann more than her own mother. In that memoir, Hold Still, Sally wrote, "Down here, you can't throw a dead cat without hitting an older, well-off white person raised by a black woman, and every damn one of them will earnestly insist that a reciprocal and equal form of love was exchanged between them. This reflects one side of the fundamental paradox of the South, that a white elite, determined to segregate the 2 races in public, based their stunningly intimate domestic arrangements on an erasure of that segregation in private. Could the feelings exchanged between 2 individuals so hypocritically divided ever have been honest, untainted by guilt or resentment? I think so. Cat-whacked and earnest, I am one of those who insist that such a relationship existed for me. I loved Gigi the way other people love their parents, and no matter how many historical demons stalked that relationship, I know that Gigi loved me back." In the exhibition, there are 2 cases that have photographs of Gigi with the Munger family. That's Mann's maiden name. The Munger family and the Mann family, and also with her own family. And in the second part of the second film in the show, at the end of the exhibition, is Sally Mann speaking with Virginia Carter's grandchildren, looking at those family pictures and seeing who they were, and Sally Mann asking some of the questions that she didn't ask at the time. When she says, what were we thinking? Why did we never ask the questions? She realizes the questions were things like, when does Gigi celebrate her Thanksgiving? When does she do her grocery shopping, and how does she get the groceries home? What if one of her own children was sick? What if she was sick? Those are the kind of questions that never occurred to her when she was growing up. And in fact, Gigi was widowed. She had 6 children. And the public education system in Virginia, for which she paid taxes, forbade classes for black children above 7th grade. And Gigi managed somehow to send each of them to out-of-state boarding schools and ultimately to college. How did she do that? Well, it was those bags of laundry that were on her front steps when Sally's dad took her home. She did laundry at night after working 12 hours at the Mann household. So those were things that just escaped her vision, and now, she's trying to understand how that blindness happened. The interwoven with, well, first there are 4 portraits that are called the Two Virginias, and in fact, Mann's second daughter, she named Virginia Franklin Mann, after Virginia Franklin Carter. And she made pictures of the two of them, in a sense, her mother and her daughter. Mother picture, a mother figure. I love this one. Gigi's strong legs like tree trunks, her feet, her enormous feet, and worn and old feet, and young Virginia's feet up there moving during the exposure, not holding still. And this beautiful picture of the two, the last one that Mann made of the two Virginias when Gigi was living in a nursing home. She was already in her late 90s. Her hands are arthritic from all those years of work, but sort of cradling the young Virginia there. And Gigi died on Christmas Day, 1994, at the age of 100. Interwoven with those pictures are photographs of African American churches throughout Virginia, printed on expired paper, and in a certain sense that parallels the fate of the churches themselves, some of which remain active and are well cared for, and others have fallen into disrepair with time and disuse. Mann herself her family was not religious, but sometimes when her parents were out of town, Gigi would take her to church, all dressed up and proper, and she wrote, Mann wrote, "When the entire congregation was in full throat, I felt as if a great wave had picked me up and was rolling me over. I went with it, tumbling like a pale piece of ocean glass, washing up outside the heavy doors at the end of the surface. Blinking in the sudden sunshine of Main Street, I reached for Gigi's hand." She's such a good writer. You've got to, if you haven't read the memoir, you've got to do it. So historically, these churches were places of spiritual refuge after the Civil War, and places of community as African Americans were allowed to hold their own services without white ministers having to be present, and without having to do so at what were called hush arbors, sort of little corners of the landscape, secretly. The next series deals with a place of physical refuge instead, and that's the Great Dismal Swamp. That's the area of southeastern Virginia, northeastern North Carolina, which was so snake-infested and tick-ridden and vine-choked, so inhospitable that it became a place where escaped slaves and some free blacks went, because it was a place where most bounty hunters and slave chasers would not venture into, because it was so inhospitable. And you get the sense of that in Mann's photographs, which are tintypes, another 19th century process. They're dark and slippery like water. And I'll talk more about the various 19th century processes in a lecture on Sunday, it's also the subject of the essay that I wrote for the catalog. If you get the catalog, the Great Dismal Swamp was also partly inspired by the history of Nat Turner, who was the leader of a violent rebellion of slaves and freed blacks in 1831 that ended with great bloodshed on both sides, and Turner himself captured and executed along with many other African Americans. And the final element in this section, the fourth element, is a series called Men, which are photographs of African American models. In a sense, the pictures of Gigi were about a bond between, white Sally and black Gigi. The Men pictures are about a divide and about the literal blood and sweat and bodies of African Americans that built the South. And it's about trying to bridge that divide. She hired models in the area. So, for instance, the figure on the left, interweaving his fingers, is a fellow named Jansen, who was a law student at Washington and Lee University right there in Lexington. And an interview with him is also part of that film that's at the end of the exhibition. So for me, the pictures are, in a sense, they're the byproduct of what Mann was doing. They're the vehicle through which she worked in order to establish a sense of trust. So it's not that the pictures are meant to be the answer. They're not necessarily going to bridge the divide. But in order to make them, Mann had to bridge that divide between herself as a white woman and with a black man who was a stranger. She had to create enough trust between the two in order to make the pictures, and to, in that sense, bridge that divide at least on an individual human level. And so I see them more as part of the process rather than as an end result, or that's the best I can describe it, I think. They're large and quite moving. And again, made with collodion negatives, like the earlier landscapes that I showed you. And the last section is one that she calls "What Remains." All the accumulation of memory. When someone dies, where does it all go? Proust has his answer. It ultimately resides in the loving and in the making and in the living of every present day. She's an extraordinarily well-read person. She studied English and writing in college, not photography. And in this last section, many of the portraits have titles that are literary references. In 2006, she suffered a really serious riding accident where the horse, I think, broke a leg and ended up falling on top of her. And it was, as close to death as she had come. And she was completely incapacitated for a long period, unable to lift a camera, unable to do most things, but still able to coat a collodion plate and put it into the camera and make self-portraits. She couldn't go out into the landscape or travel, but she became her own subject. And the pictures that she made, which are ganged here, they're ambrotypes, another 19th century process, collodion on glass with a black background, were haunting, and I think gave a sense of her own sense of the fragility of life and of our mortality. She photographed her husband, Larry. She had photographed him from the very beginning. They've been together for something like 50 years now. And about 30 years ago, he was diagnosed with late onset muscular dystrophy. So this is affecting the muscles of his limbs and of his back and abdomen. And it's a measure of his love and generosity and trust and belief in her work that he's allowed her to continue photographing him as his body begins to to lose its strength. And the picture on the right is one that she calls Hephaestus, the Greek god of metalworking who was expelled from Mount Olympus, the home of the gods, because of a physical deformity. And Larry was a blacksmith as well as a lawyer. He was a blacksmith when she met him. And so it's an appropriate title there. And the flaws that you see in the collodion, in the negative that cut through the body, are a kind of they convey the ravages of the disease, and they also have a kind of silvery molten quality that's almost like metalworking. Two more pictures. The one on the right is in this collection. I can say from back here also the one on the left is in our collection. Pondering our end. She photographed her adult children in long exposures in which they lay flat, and she put the camera above them pointing down and photographed their faces. And these are large and powerful pictures that you'll see. And there's something very moving about the central portrait, which seems to be disappearing, which is of her son Emmett, who died maybe a year ago, maybe a little longer. And the final picture in the show is of Larry at the Mann farm, this sort of smoky landscape there, looking into the distance. And at the beginning, I said that what united all of these, the 5 sections, was the place, the South, and her connection to it. And she wrote a wonderful sentence about this picture called "The Turn." She said, "As ephemeral as our footprints were in the sand along the river, so also were those moments of childhood caught in the photographs. And so will be our family itself, our marriage, the children who enriched it, and the love that has carried us through so much. What will last beyond all of it is the place." Thanks so much. I hope to see you upstairs in the gallery or outside the gallery where the party is. So we can go up there and chat more about Sally Mann's work, either in the show or over a glass. So thanks for coming tonight.